Hi friends, I'm Scott Giles, minister, hypnotist, and the guy who shows you how to get help from the other side. The other side being the mental and spiritual worlds, which you access through your unconscious mind, which is the greatest goal-achieving mechanism ever evolved. You don't have to stay stuck or ill or be unhappy if you can use the full power of your mind, because there is a power in you that can help. Well, today I want to ask you a question. Is your spirituality imperial? Even if you're one of the great many people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious, is your spirituality imperial? Let me explain. Now, in this video, I'm speaking to those of you who are part of the Christian tradition or who relate to it in a favorable way. And you were probably never taught the model I'm about to explain. But there are actually three versions of Christian philosophy in the New Testament. I just taught a class on this, and so I thought it would be fun to explain these three different Christian traditions so you could consider them and see if there is a particular interpretive slant that speaks to you, or if you're already on one of these paths, would insights from the other paths also be helpful? Now, as I begin this, I need to talk about something called the fallacy of biblical univocality. This is the belief that all of the material in the Bible agrees with all of the other material, that the Bible speaks with one voice, univocality. That all the different parts of the Bible tell aspects of the same story, and this is the mainstream belief, fiercely maintained by many people who relate to the Christian tradition, probably most of them. However, if you want to believe that everything in the Bible agrees with everything else in the Bible, you should make it a point never to read the Bible. Because if you do, you will soon encounter problems. For example, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 2, verse 4, we're told to beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks. However, Joel 3:10 tells us the opposite, that we should beat our plowshares into swords and our pruning hooks into spears. And there's a lot of material like that. Now, most scholars take the view that the different material in the Bible represents different sorts of literature and needs to be interpreted using different rules. For example, in the book of Genesis, at the beginning of the Old Testament, we have mythology. In the book of Leviticus, we have a law book. In the book of Psalms, we have a hymnal. In the Song of Songs, we have erotic poetry, and so on. In this view, which I agree with, it is easy to see that the entirety of the New Testament can also contain materials of different sorts. The Gospels are spiritual biography. The letters are administrative correspondence. The book of Revelation is mystical vision. So in this view, there are three distinct strands of material that history has come to deal with differently, and most people don't recognize. Now, the first strand would be the actual teachings of Jesus when he was alive, as nearly as we can determine them. Now, Jesus' actual name was Yeshua ben Yosef of Nazareth, Jesus being a shortened form that most people use for convenience. This teaching centers around four concepts, which in the biblical Greek of ancient times called Koine Greek are agape, metanoia, elpas, and eucharita, or in English, agape, kindness and charity, metanoia, the transformation of consciousness. Elpis, positive expectation. And eukarita, gratitude. People who follow a contemplative or meditative spiritual path typically reach out to this material, and it's the basis of the work traditionally called that of the Desert Fathers, although I would say Desert Fathers and Mothers, as there were women there. These were the people who pulled away from the institutional church when it became the state religion of Rome under the Emperor Constantine in 312 Common Era. They wanted nothing to do with a state religion, and so pulled off into the desert to create their own way, relatively independent of church institutions and hierarchy. When you encounter teachers talking about the importance of meditation, contemplation, retreats, reflective reading, or lectio divina, they're relating to this material most of all. The second interpretive strand is the material created by Paul, and this is the Imperial tradition. You see, Paul was a citizen of Imperial Rome. It was the only form of governance he knew. And so as he busied himself creating the early institutional church, he did so basing it on the model of the Roman Empire, and this becomes the imperial tradition within Christianity. When you find people saying things like Christ is King, Jesus is Lord, kneel before him, and talking about the kingdom of God, you're talking about the imperial tradition. The terms all reflect royalty, imperialism, and aristocracy. And that results directly because it was the model that Paul used. Now, Jesus himself, as far as we can tell, never referred to himself as a king or an aristocrat. He certainly didn't ask people to bow before him, in fact, very much to the contrary. However, this is the material that people who follow the modern tradition of Christian nationalism appeal to most often. Unlike the Desert Fathers and Mothers who wanted nothing to do with a state religion, the Pauline or Imperial tradition very much wanted to be a state religion and does so to this day. We see it among those who see the spiritual universe as a strict hierarchy with God and Jesus at the top, and very formal ways of relating to those lower down in the power structure. One of Paul's first actions, once he became an apostle, was to meet with the governor of Cyprus. He was not preaching to the poor. He was preaching to the elite of his time. And from what we can gather from the letters he wrote that are part of the New Testament, he was mostly engaging with wealthy and powerful people in the Roman Empire who had the wherewithal to support him. And some of this is reflected even in the mainstream modern traditions of, for example, the Pope wearing the color purple, the color formerly reserved for the Emperor of Rome. And to this day, the Pope is formally called the Pontifex Maximus, which was actually the title of the most senior priestly rank in the ancient pagan Roman religion. We also see it in the Catholic cardinals wear the ritual color of scarlet, once reserved for the members of the Roman Senate during the Roman Empire. Now, as I mentioned, this is the interpretive strand popular among those who see a connection between their religion and their political goals for society. In this understanding, the Roman Empire didn't really end. It was just sort of rebranded as the early Christian church, with local bishops taking over the functions of the civil state, increasingly functioning as city administrators, distributing grain, and anchoring other civic social services by the 5th century. So to these folks, Paul's thinking comes first. Everything else comes second. And this is probably what most people who relate to the Christian tradition think of. They think of the Imperial tradition. Jesus is Lord, the kingdom of heaven, and they use these aristocratic terms. The third formulation of the material in the New Testament is the Johannine tradition. This is the material in the New Testament that was supposedly authored by people named John. And they weren't the same John in all cases. You have the Gospel of John by one writer, you have the Book of Revelation by John of Patmos, and the Johannine letters of various authors. Well, apparently all written by different people, this material does organize itself around the idea of an almost mystical connection to Jesus of Nazareth as a spiritual being. We see this today in the so-called emerging church, which is non-denominational, informal, looking to charity and good works rather than to theology or to political maneuvering. The folks who follow this emerging strand take the view that spirituality should continue to evolve, and that differences in interpretation are welcome rather than being heresy, because they can illuminate different aspects of the tradition. I've noticed the emerging church really leans heavily on music and on the spiritual states that can be achieved by immersion in music. And this is a fast-growing philosophy in our time. Now, in my view, these three different interpretive philosophies regarding how to understand the New Testament material are all valid. I'm personally a contemplative, so I like the first strand of interpretation, but the others aren't wrong, they're just different. But there are consequences to which interpretive tradition you follow. The contemplative tradition is spacious, making room for different opinions and an almost libertarian willingness to let people work out their own path to spiritual development. The Pauline or Imperial tradition is much less tolerant of dissent, and those communities and groups that follow it tend to have strict codes of right or wrong and an eager willingness to push their particular opinions onto society at large. The emerging church, however, is much more relaxed, cleaving to the Johannine focus on personal religious experience, and tends not to get involved overmuch in politics or telling people what to do beyond a few broad specifics. So is your spirituality contemplative, imperial, emerging? Think about it in terms of this model and ask whether the other traditions might have something to offer you. Hey, thank you for your time and attention today. I'll be back next week with another talk on a different subject. If you're wondering if I can be of help to you, consider working directly with me. We can work in person or online. Feel free to reach out through my website for a complimentary, no-obligation discovery call. And always use the full power of your mind, because you deserve it.